Hi, I'm Sabrina Monarch, and we're talking today about what evolutionary astrology is. A lot of us here in this meeting today, it's kind of the water that we're swimming in, so I want to talk about what that water is. And for those of you who are watching this video who don't know what evolutionary astrology is, I'm also excited to share it with you. I have come up with a few points that we can move through today to really describe what this system is. And that would be moving through the archetypes of Neptune, of Pluto, and of the lunar nodes, the north and south node of the moon. And these are all actually, very watery archetypes. So we're going to be swimming through the emotional feeling tones of what evolutionary astrology is. And yeah, so let's get started. To start with Neptune, these archetypes are not unique to evolutionary astrology, by the way, but the logic of moving from the oneness that Neptune represents to this individuated soul and the personality that the soul takes on in a lifetime is an evolutionary astrology form of logic and of looking at ourselves. Neptune as an archetype relates to this oneness that we all come from, an ultimate transcendence. It's related to unconditional love and this feeling of union. It can be very womb-like in a sense. Maybe the experience of the womb in one human context, and it can also be the cosmic womb. It's a sense of feeling no differentiation, feeling very connected to everything. And evolutionary astrology is a way of looking at the chart that gets at, what are we doing as these human forms that are separate from that oneness that we may eventually return to, that we emerged from. Evolutionary astrology comes with a cosmology, I would say, of describing why we're here. Neptune, as an astrological archetype, relates to ultimate spiritual truths as well as illusions. We can think of it like a film, and when you're watching a film, or it can also be in a dream that you're having, where you get so engrossed in the film, or you're so deep into the dream that you don't know you're watching a film, or you don't know that you're dreaming. This, in a way, is kind of how Neptune works through our experience, is that it will support our illusions and our projections for a time. Whatever we worship, whatever we put value in, whatever we see as ultimate, may appear that way for a time until that particular wave of understanding crashes and returns to the ocean itself. So in a way, I just want to contextualize, it's interesting to start out with Neptune because it's so kind of mystical and out there, but just to think do you remember being born? Probably not. Do you remember where you were before you were born? Also probably not. Some people may have access to those memories, but for the most part, the average person doesn't. We're suddenly just kind of awake and walking around in this reality. And sure, there may be ways to talk about that in terms of you didn't have your brain formulated in this certain way as an infant to record memory, or you can explain it in that way. But I want to look at it from the mystical approach of how do we just kind of wake up walking around in this reality? That's kind of that haze of Neptune that we're going to touch first. Evolutionary astrology, which I didn't mention before, is astrology from Pluto's point of view. So it can relate to this desire to be here. It's Pluto as an archetype is primordial. It's about desire. It's about attraction. The image that came to mind just now is the sense of the soul really being excited to be here and having an attraction to the parents or to the circumstances that it's going to be born into. Kind of like, here's my wave to catch, here's my wave to surf. That wave emerging out of the ultimate ocean. So cosmologically, if I can backtrack here, we are having a specific, unique experience emerging from the oneness as these individuals. And as these individuals who don't necessarily remember where we came from, that's kind of, you know, accessible in some mystical states, accessible to some mystics, accessible in regression work, but generally it's kind of a haze, kind of confusing, Neptunian. Evolutionary astrology and the way that we read the chart can help us get an idea of the soul's history by looking at the placement of Pluto and the lunar nodes. I start with Neptune, though, because it relates to the ultimate, and Pluto relates to the things that we kind of hook into or latch onto or form these connections with that aren't the ultimate, but there's this deep kind of memory of union that transcends the forms of union that we may experience here. But the union that we do experience here is kind of like a portal into that ultimate or deeper mystical union. In our forming like security attachments or getting attached to things or getting addicted to things, that's a very Pluto like kind of experience. It's having a desire nature that keeps us returning life to life, and certain things evolve and become empowered, and other things are a form of struggle or adversity. Pluto is a very dramatic and exciting archetype, I think. It has to do with sex, death, and rebirth and transformation. It's like magnetism, it's attraction and repulsion. And with that, the soul incarnates into circumstances in a way that it's attracted to. And by attracted, it doesn't mean that from this kind of calm place, it's like, oh, I like that. That seems like a good life. You know, it's like also the magnetic repulsion aspects. It's these parts of our experience that we really want to transform. It's the places that we're ready to evolve and become really conscious in. So we could be thrown into early life dynamics, for example, that are really difficult in some way, or are in direct opposition to what we desire in this life. You know, if someone's core desire nature has something to do with learning autonomy and independence, they might incarnate into a circumstance that's loaded with a lot of codependency themes so that they can very dramatically transform in relation to that Pluto archetype. Pluto is about power. It's about energy exchange. It's about taboos and undercurrents. And it can speak to the experience that's happening below maybe the conscious layer. Depending on aspects a person might have in their natal chart to Pluto, it can be inflected in different areas of life. But just thinking about the being below the person, the being that incarnates multiple times, and this particular lifetime is just one of many of those incarnations. And that would then bring us to the lunar nodes, which Pluto is kind of like the wave emerging out of the ocean, and that's a soul that emerges out of the oneness and has a series of lives. But how we understand those series of lives comes from Pluto in the natal chart with evolutionary astrology, as well as the nodes of the moon. And I'm going to share my screen for a moment. And this is just a picture to understand a little bit more about what the lunar nodes are. It's the intersection between the orbit of the Earth around the sun and the orbit of the moon around the Earth. It forms the south and north node. And in Vedic astrology, which I take a lot of my kind of mythology of the lunar nodes from Vedic astrology and my praxis and understanding of how they work in the natal chart from what I've learned in evolutionary astrology. The south node of the moon can speak to our past lives, specifically ego structures that the soul has taken on. The Pluto in the natal chart is going to be the why, or just like this deeper identity. And the lunar nodes are kind of like the ego incarnations, the costumes, the vehicles that have been taken on by the soul. In Vedic astrology, we can refer to the south node as like the tail of the dragon. And it has this energy of like sweeping up karmic debris. A lot of our south node themes relate to karmic relives, repetitions. It's a sense of how our early childhood themes, and even before our first Saturn return, we're often reliving dynamics from prior lives. It's kind of swept up into the air and relived. The North Node is the head of the dragon, said to be in Vedic astrology. And it's like, then in evolutionary astrology, it relates a lot to how the soul is going to grow in this life. It's the forward momentum. I like bringing in the images of the head and tail because the head is, the direction, the tail is just following. People can get stuck experientially when they're kind of only doing their south node. It's what they know the best, but it's kind of like the dragon chasing its tail and it's staying in place, and there's a stagnancy. Maybe there's some more psychological addictions playing out in that, just like our tendencies that we can't seem to get over. And what's so beautiful about studying the North Node is that it's this set of, in a way, it can really be personality traits. It's an opposite archetype. The lunar nodes always are a duality, so it could be Aries, Libra, Taurus, Scorpio, third house, ninth house. There's these opposite spectrums. And you'll find with evolutionary astrology and looking at the chart this way that there's a lot of energy constellated, say where Pluto is by sign and house, not so much in the opposite sign or house. And then the south node, say in Leo, and Aquarius is wanting to be developed through the North Node. It's this direction. Some of the ways when I've been seeking for ways to describe what evolutionary astrology is, I've gotten the images of Neptune, the ocean that we're coming out of, the oneness, the wave, Pluto, the desire, the propulsion, the reason for existing. There's so much power and energy with Pluto, whereas Neptune is going to be like this surrender and this sense of return. One thing that evolutionary astrology stresses is that we're on these evolutionary journeys where we've separated from source. There's a certain desire to be separate from source. And yet we do carry with us that nostalgia or that desire to come back. But we don't come back by going backwards. It's not like you can be unbirthed and go back through, how you got here. You have a life and you make choices and you experience karma. You have desires. And these desires that we have can be a catalyst for our growth and our evolution. And I'll get a little bit more to that piece of it in a moment, but just to come back to this kind of teleology of the ocean wave and turning into a soul. I think some people have different perspectives on what reincarnation might be like if there's, difference, I don't know how to put it as not this, but the way that evolutionary astrology pictures it is this one soul that has many different incarnations, where I guess some people think that incarnations don't have a linear history, like one soul being incarnating multiple times. But that's what this way of chart analysis and this kind of astrology will illuminate, is resourcing Pluto and the lunar nodes and connecting factors in the chart. Where does the soul come from? What's this deeper history? So out of Neptune, then out of Pluto, then you have the ego, the moon, this personality. So you and I, we have names, we have this current contemporary identity. Maybe we have less language for talking about our soul or where we came from in the past, unless we happen to study evolutionary astrology, in which case we may have many stories and ideas of who we were in past lives. The lunar nodes then add this extra element of tendencies, kind of patterns, what have been if we know the desire from Pluto, the lunar nodes are going to tell us the how, basically. And with desire, evolutionary astrology as a practice. I hope that I'm keeping people, or like what I'm saying is making sense. If anyone has questions in the chat, let me know. But I feel like as I've started, this may make more sense to people who are already in the practice, as I've just kind of launched into its waters by invoking even the water archetype. Anyway, evolutionary astrology suggests that desire is a catalyst of evolution. You might have other forms of spiritual seeking that say that desire is the cause of suffering and that the goal is to not really have desire. And that can have some wisdom in it, but at the same time, if you suppress a desire, you haven't actually moved through it or exhausted it. You don't get the evolution. There's just a stagnancy. It's kind of like fighting nature. Pluto as an archetype is very much like this propulsive force of nature. And so as I've been studying evolutionary astrology for the last 5 years, it teaches me a lot about the value of desire and having compassion for what it is we want in life, and how the soul knows that. And yet desire and the things we most deeply want can be our cutting edge of transformation, relating also to Pluto being an archetype of transformation. Because there's resistance, it's like you could have some feeling on an inner level of who you are and everything around you doesn't reflect that. From a non-Plutonic viewpoint, it could just be like, well, I guess be what everyone else thinks you are, be what reality already is. But Pluto has this deeper stake in bringing forth and like flaring forth, if you will, what its intention or what its teleology is. And because of that, it's a very sharp and intense archetype. You can have some of these disempowering or manipulative or forceful energies emerge out of Pluto because the desire nature is so strong and it just wants to like push past the resistance and get its way no matter what. And so you have the shadow element of Pluto. You also have the finesse or like the enlightenment side of Pluto, where there's a deep respect of what's wanting to emerge, but there's a co-creation with the universe and a personal alchemical process that happens, so that the individual's process as a person and as a spiritual being are moving towards in the same direction. And it's not about, getting what one wants at the expense of someone else or something like that. It becomes more of an empowered Plutonic state. You can think of it again as magnetism, and instead of repelling what you want, being attractive towards it, and it actually playing out. And when you look at the chart through the evolutionary astrology lens, the technique, I'm not going to get so deep into that today because that's what you learn it for. It takes time. You have to study it. And there's a lot of intricacies to it. But there is this emphasis, I feel like, within evolutionary astrology that you can see the chart from this perspective of what has this soul been doing for many lifetimes, and what opposite archetypes or what complementary archetypes are wanting to be developed. We've all, for those of us that do study it, and if you're going to study it at some point, you can learn a lot just about Pluto through the signs and houses of like these deeper personality traits between, like Pluto in a particular sign and house, and see certain themes that emerge in terms of the disempowered use of those archetypes versus the empowerment that's wanting to come through. So even just studying the storytelling that emerges from evolutionary astrology can suggest ways of like really accessing high level expressions of Pluto placements rather than the ones that are more shadowy in nature. Another part of Pluto's archetype is the sense of energy exchange or osmosis. And so from this form of astrology, we're also really studying that experience, which is how do we, at a deep fundamental level, like on a soul level, change by virtue of what we focus on. And this could be, a transmutation of consciousness that happens through meditation. You focus on a concept and it starts to seep into your consciousness. It could be a relationship where, because of your relationship to another person, you experience the emergence of your own personality traits that the other person reflects back in you or wakes you up to. If you learn something, if you connect with a practice like yoga or something, you're transforming yourself by merging with it. When we use the evolutionary astrology chart analysis method, we get an idea of how the soul has been merging with things for a while, like what's kind of already done. And it may have resulted in a lot of strengths and talents, like people's natural affinities. It also relates to where people are addicted or where people kind of hit their head against a wall, like trying to get their basic primordial needs met in a way that they've done before. And it's like the dragon chasing its tail. And what they're needing is this merging with these other personality traits, which come through the lunar nodes. And usually the north node, unless there's mitigating factors, which you'll find, like if a planet squares the nodes, then there's some other things to consider, as well as when Pluto is conjunct one of the nodes. But as I've been getting deeper into this practice, I didn't have a definition for what the lunar nodes were. I was thinking about them, I was working with them, and I knew the qualities associated with the placements. I thought of the south node maybe as a deep memory and the north node as the evolutionary direction that's supported. But I mean, practically, what are those things? And it started to become illuminated that the lunar nodes are very much like personality traits, and that our personality, while at one layer can be just the ego and there's something that restricts us from connecting to spirit, the ego can be kind of crusty. If you think of like Cancer as an archetype relating to the ego through evolutionary astrology, it's like a shell that we wear that keeps us disconnected from life and in our safety zone. But a lot of people's egos or personalities play up things they're already good at. It's like using your strength as a crutch, so you don't have to deal with the things that are vulnerable. So it's going to be a double-sided thing. There's these traits that you come from that relate to a bunch of talents that you have, and also your limitations. By accessing the North Node, in most charts, in most cases, you're identifying a different set of personality traits. Let's take an example of Aries to Libra. If we're starting with an Aries South Node person to a Libra North Node person. The Aries South Node, whatever their particular desire nature is, as we analyze through Pluto, they've been utilizing personality structures that relate to Aries, such as independence and a kind of willfulness, a sense of autonomy, and really wanting their own way. Like there's a Aries quality that comes through of just kind of, it can be a defensive one. There's a vision of like kind of being, this fresh spring babe out of the Piscean Neptunian oneness. So it's a little orphan-like, but also there's like this sense of, mission, wanting to accomplish something and having a lot of energy. But a person's been doing that for many lifetimes, and what they haven't really developed is their North Node, which is Libra, which is a lot about harmony and cooperating with others and forming relationships. And so this person might find along their evolutionary journey that when they keep just trying to force their way through life and get their way by being the strongest and the best and the most competitive, that they don't get what they want. And then if they were to stumble upon it naturally in life, which many people do, or you can study it and really work it, which evolutionary astrology allows, you could look at your North Node in Libra and realize that everything that you want, the deep, true essence of what you want isn't wrong or bad. It's not going to come from being like a bully anymore or just being really forceful, but it's going to be this time about North Node and Libra, forming relationships, learning about harmony. So I think it offers a kind of practice, like a yoga of how to move through life in a way that is more supported by evolution itself. And evolution and Pluto are deeply connected. So it's a perfect word for it. Evolutionary astrology is a Pluto-based astrology, but the more that I like sink into Pluto and meditate on it, it definitely has this kind of teleology and this bursting forth that when we think about evolution and something, about the universe rushing to become itself, they evoke that same kind of feeling. The direction of evolutionary astrology, again, in its cosmology, and it could be in practice as well. Once I learned about it in 2012, I started to just practice it. Like I used to have, desires. Before then, sometimes I would be really bent on getting my way, and like I would be ambitious and persevere and, all of that kind of stuff. But other times I would want something and think like, oh, that's frivolous, or that could never be, or like, I can't have that, and kind of push it away. And when I realized that desire was a catalyst for growth and that it represented a person's cutting edge, I started to take them more seriously and more prayerfully and invite them to be a spiritual process for me, to bring them into prayer. And when I had learned with evolutionary astrology at first that the satisfaction of a desire just results in a new desire. The point being that you keep exhausting desires until there's no desire left except to be one with Source. I still think about that. I wonder about what that means. I wonder about what I've heard about ascended masters that come back to help others evolve. So I think that there's many different possibilities. There's so many different ways that we can talk about reincarnation, why we're here, what's happened along the way. Another piece that astrology, this evolutionary astrology really brings in is a study of karma and maybe the consequences, in a sense, of past attachments and actions. In the West, we are very ready to associate karma with this concept of the Judeo-Christian sin construct, where people do bad things and are punished. Karma's a bitch, like it's there to get you. But karma has a lot more of a subtle quality to it. And evolutionary astrology is this beautiful fusion of its Western astrology, but it brings in these Eastern concepts like karma. But as an example, what do we mean by karma in evolutionary astrology? It's seeing how our attachments and how we've acted upon reality and what kind of structures of identity we've formed in the past have carried over into this life. A lot of, I guess, like trauma stuff, evolutionary astrology can be a great medicine for, because we can actually locate, here's these tricky or difficult or traumatic dynamics in this current incarnation. Here's my chart. And you can actually kind of gain this map of why those things are happening, and maybe what kinds of inner dynamics have been wanting to emerge, as well as just where the soul has gotten stagnant or traumatized in the past and kind of stuck somewhere in time, and thus like repeating those dynamics. I'm going to pause there and ask if there's any questions, and I'll also check what was in the chat box. Pete was saying in the chat that it's interesting that for some the South Node is conjunct Pluto and the North Node is conjunct the Pluto polarity point. So this life is reflecting a potential solution of the evolutionary karma. I think, another thing I would say about that one in particular is when the South Node's conjunct Pluto, it can correlate with people that live out their South Node longer, instead of just doing that at the beginning of life and moving towards the North Node. There's extra desire to relive some of the past dynamics, or the past is like, it's just especially important in some way. I would say Pluto conjunct the North Node can be one of those like bursting, like ready for the movement forward. Pluto on the South Node can be more relive stuff. But also I'm going to keep that in mind, because I think that I'll think about that one. Yeah, I think when I was talking or thinking about what I was going to say today, I almost meant to be more definitive or set up a portrait, and somehow I got whirlpooled into something. So I'll have to actually try again at some point. Yet I hope there was still something in here that was useful. And let's see where I want to go with this. Is there any questions or any thoughts from anyone? Just like also like, when it comes to even describing what evolutionary astrology is, I find that question to be something that I'm working on answering every day. It's something that I do, it's somewhere that I live. But how do you talk about it? That's still the question that I'm asking. So I'd love to hear from other people, maybe how you describe it, or where there's maybe a gap in your ability to describe it. And I would love to offer some ideas and thoughts.
Sabrina, do you see the ego and the soul as our awareness of these things as one or separate?
Thanks, that's a good question. It depends on the individual, and it might be reflected in their chart. Like I'm a Moon Pluto opposition, and I feel like Pluto is directly like kind of lighting up my moon, like a full moon, except with Pluto. And I've always felt like a certain periscope consciousness or something, like being a submarine or something, and having a certain perceptive depth that felt always like there was more happening than what seemed like age appropriate. Like even as a child, just feeling like this reverberation of echo into something deeper. So the thought of, the ego and the soul, like they're very deeply in conversation for me. And I think about like myself as a soul often and how my ego is in relationship to that. But you might have someone who has like a Pluto moon square where there's more of a collision. Or you might have like an inconjunct or something, like the 150 degree. And I think of like maybe someone as an example, like who lives a life they don't totally identify with. Like they have a desire to be something, but they've, fallen comfortably into some other kind of life, or maybe a job they don't like, or maybe some kind of public role they don't like. And so they actually are kind of at odds with their ego and their soul. I think of the ego and the soul as these, two parts of the personality, and how they're interacting in harmony or dissonance is really unique to the individual. I think something I love about evolutionary astrology as a practice is the way that it has really spiritualized the ego, which made me embrace spirituality full on. Because when I first learned about, like I read the Tao Te Ching in high school, and I felt really conflicted after I read it because I felt like I'd read something really true, but I wasn't willing to give up what I considered, my individuality or what I wanted to be in this life. And I thought, from that perspective at that moment, that being spiritual meant not really being an individual, or like not having desire. And I think that in terms of spiritual systems that kind of suggest transcending the earth plane and transcending the body and being, out there and like one with the universe and like neglecting this realm, there's something, I'll have to think about how to, classify that, if it's patriarchal or whatever, but there's something so earthy and so grounding about developing an understanding of what the purpose of the ego is in this lifetime, so that rather than it being this kind of, lens that you have to like free yourself of so that you can see more clearly, it's like being able to take that lens on and off at will, or to see like how the soul wanted to exist in this particular form so that it could learn these certain lessons before it returns or ascends somehow. But that I think that evolutionary astrology bridges the gap between like enlightenment as an endpoint and the process of getting there being this like messy, dynamic earth process. So I hope that I kind of went on a tangent, but I hope that that answers it.
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else? I'll say another thing that makes evolutionary astrology, what it is the idea that we're the center of everything that happens to us, that there's like this no victim mindset. And there's something really powerful and kind of esoteric about that. It's like really coming into empowerment instead of projecting the soul onto these other things. The soul can kind of collect itself and begin to manifest and create a reality that it aligns with. And I've found that that kind of thinking, it doesn't appeal to everyone, and it isn't always appropriate in every situation. It can be really meaningful for people, though, that want to, I guess, like feel at home in their circumstances and gain more agency and more free will in life. And that it's like when you're ready to take that kind of power, I guess, and assume responsibility for the things that happen around you. At the same time, holding that with things like social justice, it's like, can we create a better world? And there's like a piece of dharma in it too, I guess, like how, how we might make circumstances better for everyone. And also that it wouldn't be ethical or just with this kind of knowledge, and like with the wisdom that evolutionary astrology affords to kind of like blame people for their circumstances, like, oh, that's your fault, or this is something you earned in a past life, or those kind of, I don't think evolutionary astrology is for that. I think it's for gaining agency in life and starting to kind of realize one's subtle influence in things that are happening around them. Like if a certain pattern keeps repeating in your life, discovering your own inner hook to that pattern and whatever it represents, and going through personal alchemical transformation so that you start to attract a different reality around you. And in this way, I think evolutionary astrology and its connection to Pluto, like it is about your cutting edge. It's like, what's the most intense part of your experience? Like Pluto is desire, and it's also pain. It's intense emotion. And so it's interesting. It's just like, it can address like how to bring forth your desires, how to have more free will, and also how to kind of like rehab yourself from like deep suffering by changing yourself to change your circumstances. And yeah, that's something I love about it a lot. Yeah. Wasn't sure. Sorry?
Do you think that Mars being the lower octave of Pluto has something to do with what you just said? Like
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, because Mars is about our will, and it both, it wants freedom and wants to move forward. Pluto's the deep free will that comes with, I mean, it's like being a ninja or something. It's like being able to navigate things at a deeper layer of awareness. And in a similar way, like if you think about like unconscious complexes that we have, thwarting our will in life, if we become psychologically and deeply self-aware, we have more agency to be ourselves versus being controlled by our unconscious.
Very interesting. Thank you. And I think Pete had something to say. Go ahead.
Hi there. Good evening. Good evening, Sabrina. Yeah, I mean, I just had the feeling, I made this point in chat, that I feel that my own ego has, been fighting Pluto until the point where I just have to let go. And synchronously, that comes at a time when, I discover astrology, I discover evolutionary astrology, and I start looking into this. And it's just the whole thing is happening at the same time, but there is a real letting go, and that I've been resisting that transition to my Pluto polarity point and fighting it, and it's interesting what Linda was saying about Mars. It's like there's a kind of battle, and then there's a point where we lay down arms. and we move into a point of accepting. And that is, for me, really, one of the most profound things. Just accepting the way things are and accepting the process. Yeah, that's all I can say.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That does bring in the resistance part of Pluto, and the way that sometimes the ego is like afraid of the soul in some way, or like the soul is so powerful and the ego has like its own context for understanding it. Pluto reminds me a lot of I can't remember the exact quote, I think it's Jung, but something about how the treasures we seek are like in a cave or something. There's like a dark or scary kind of passage before we find the treasure of our soul, that we're scared of the things that we want the most. Pluto has a connection to the taboo, and there's it's a powerful thing. And I mean, even just thinking about like, how does the current contemporary being, who has its own history in terms of just this life and this culture, really comprehend and understand the drives that are emerging from the whole being that is like I think of the soul, like it takes on multiple bodies, like it moves through different incarnations, like it's a pretty vast and intense being to do that. So it's like, that's the cutting edge piece of it, I guess, is like moving through the resistance, not in like a violent or controlling or like manipulative way that's part of the Pluto shadow, but like the surrender piece that you're talking about, where you accept the nature of Pluto and experience it. It forms a kind of spiritual path. Most of us here were born with the Neptune-Pluto sextile as well, which I think adds to that even more so. Was Chuck about to say something too?
Yes, Sabrina. I like what you've been saying. One of the things that you said made me want to put this out there about our own personal power. I have Pluto conjunct North Node in the 9th, and Pluto rules my chart and my moon, and is square to the moon in the 12th. And I don't, when I try to work my way down to the bottom line of what it's all about, I always get to the point where I think I'm responsible for everything, including the world. In other words, when I change something, well, we have a lot of unrest in the world, because there's a lot of unrest in me. But if I were to change and get rid of all the garbage inside of me, the world would be a better place. I would experience a world just the way the inside of me is. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's part of the complexity and like beauty of the like practice path of evolutionary astrology, is that I think of it like yoga or like stretching, where you get to have these revelations or advancements when an inner part of you transforms. But I do think there's also these vaster forces, the collective force, and that we're in energy exchange with the cosmos and with other humans and with the socio-political sphere, and so I think becoming deeply self-aware gives us freedom to not take on the pain of like things that aren't our own, so that we can be clear and emanate a frequency that heals, for example. But I also think that we can be gentle with ourselves, and that.
Well, ultimately, we are, excuse me for interrupting you, ultimately we are all one. And the Neptune thing, and I've got with my moon in the 12th house, maybe that's pushing through, but we're all one now too. We just don't remember that we're all one. And so the others and the way that they interchange or interact with us is just us. Maybe it's crazy. It's like,
That's the transformation piece of it. Like when I first started using this system for my own personal growth, I would see the messages that I was getting from people reflected back at me, that were in conflict with what I actually wanted. And so I started to change my self-concept and use affirmations and change my habits to be a different person. And then I started to get the kind of feedback that I was intending. And learning about this system helped me not feel, disempowered by other people's realities imposed onto mine of like, oh, they must be right, or everyone says this thing about me, so it must be true. It was like I can actually change on the inside. And I think it gets more, subtler and subtler. And I would notice even things too, like it's a lot of working with energy, I think, and the essence of things. And so, the desire could be self-love as an essence, but if the way that you're getting there is to kind of beat yourself up for not being good enough, you could tune in and be like, oh, I'm vibrating with this kind of masochism. Let me try again. And just like play with the vibrations that you're putting out and see what happens. And yeah, I mean, in a way, it's a helpful system for people that are very sensitive to other energies, because it's a look at how these are mutually infusing one another, and there's different directions that energy is moving, and people can learn how to harness their own creative potentials rather than being overpowered. And also learn about kind of how to, what power truly is and how to wield it ethically. To study what manipulation is and why, and how we use manipulation to feel secure, and how if we just felt secure, we wouldn't have to manipulate. So.
thank you. It's very good.
Yeah, thank you for sharing too.
You're welcome.
Could I just add a point here?
Yeah.
I mean, I think Chiron in Pisces has really made us all so much aware of, like taking on, the global pain.
Yeah, and square Saturn too. Like
absolutely. We've become aware of, more aware of the earth. We've become aware of the oceans. We've become aware of all this kind of stuff, what we're doing to each other, what we're doing to the planet. There's a huge, in this transit, we're taking on board so much stuff. And I guess that with Chiron moving into Aries, we're gonna, there's going to be a huge transformation, because we're going to take our own healing as a kind of first level. Like, okay, we've been aware now, we've become aware of what's going on. And we're going to work with ourselves in a way to empower ourselves, heal ourselves first, and then take that healing out into the world. So we're stepping up. And this is where for me, Chiron is conjunct my Pluto polarity point. And I think a lot of people of my generation, so I was born like 63, we have this Pluto Chiron relationship, which is waking us up into taking this kind of healing, global healing, larger healing out into the world.
I think yeah, I mean the piece too about like I've seen people feel despair or feel disempowered by the state of the world, and there's this conventional or like cultural conditioned sense that reality can be affected only by tangible, measurable actions. But I think there's a subtle activism that can emerge from spiritual communities, which can be balanced with doing things, and like living with integrity and adding positive things into the world. But I think that the more that people get in touch with themselves and their power and start to emanate images of peace, and start emanating a frequency of peace and of benevolence, that energy can be more accessible in the world, and that becoming full of despair or anger because of the world situation doesn't help clean it up. And a study of power and personal power could be a huge turning point for people contributing meaningful energy and vibrations to the world situation. And that being said, we've had Uranus and Aries too, so that fire of people getting angry is part of that dynamic. I hope that Chiron and Aries can also reflect like a medicinal use of will too. Yeah, so thanks for bearing with me. I feel like I need to get more organized. The next time that I try to talk about what evolutionary astrology is, I know many of you here already know what it is too, so we just kind of got to deepen into it a little bit more. But if you guys have any feedback or thoughts for me, I would love to hear that, because I definitely am going to be working on making like a webinar or something of this same thing, but maybe with a little bit more structure. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That was fantastic. Thank you. And thanks from all of us, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks.
Thanking you very much.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you.